From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Tab Murphy, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan. And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of the show. I hope you've enjoyed the last few weeks with the different episodes we've done and split them up into two for different content reasons. Nevertheless, if you've enjoyed this week's or the last few weeks' episodes, do us a favor, subscribe, comment, share, all that fun jazz that they tell you to do, so it helps boost the algorithm. Nevertheless, though, we have an amazing guest, and it's such a privilege to have him on to speak to some projects he's been part of that are celebrating major anniversaries this year, which I'm sure he never fathomed would be possible back when he did it. Nevertheless, I will do my little intro because, of course, everyone deserves their pomp and circumstance. Although originating from the Evergreen State, my guest this week has rightfully found his place amongst this generation's most creative minds when it comes to putting pen to paper, although now some would say fingers to keys. For the last 40 years, Tab Murphy has been demonstrating the ability to stretch the laws of creativity and possibility to some of the film's greatest examples of art. Whether you're on a deep-sea expedition, saving the planet, finding your true self, and many more, who better do this than our guest this week? It is our highest honor and privilege to be joined by Washington State's Jules Verne, the one and only Mr. Tab Murphy. Tab, how are you today?
Washington State's Jules Verne. Now, that is one I have not heard before, but thank you. I appreciate that. That's awesome.
Well, it's always an interesting thing to talk to people, or even just in general, to have really creative people on. So this is a treat for myself, which I'll go into more detail later on. Now, I'm curious in this aspect, and it may be sort of relative to my own self. I am from Rhode Island, a small community called South Kingstown, Rhode Island, and it's not a place like a New York City, a LA, or now in Austin, Texas, where
Right.
a certain demographic live, where you're going to be seeing celebrity people or famous people walking through town and talking to them. I've had people who've shared those stories. And for yourself, growing up in Washington State, all the way up in the Pacific Northwest, how does someone like yourself find the interest in wanting to be a film work, people working in film, even though I know early on you wanted to be a forest ranger?
Yeah, I mean, I think I never considered it a possibility because of the things you just mentioned. Coming from a small town, being so far away from the movie business. Uh, I went with the flow of what a lot of my contemporaries were going with at the time when they were coming out of high school. They were either going to the University of Washington and becoming lawyers and whatever, or they were going across the state to Washington State University and becoming forestry majors or, botanists, or even there was a great vet school there. Or they were just staying. They didn't go to college at all. They went to work for their fathers and or mothers, and they stayed in the hometown. So I mean, I didn't consider uh, the movie business as something that was for me initially. Um, but having said that, from a very early age, I loved writing. I loved storytelling. I loved creative writing. I mean, in in middle school and high school, most of my friends hated creative writing, and I loved it.
Yeah.
I just absolutely loved it. So I knew there was something there that I enjoyed, but I didn't really pinpoint it as a way to a career, or I never really took it that seriously. Um, but there was a moment my first year at Washington State University, chasing a forestry or a forest ranger career, where I realized that wasn't really what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when I was brutally honest with myself about what I wanted to do, I was kind of shocked at the answer, which was I want to, go down. I want to make movies. I want to be in the movie business. I want to tell stories. I want to either direct movies or write them. Or I had no clue. So I went to a counselor, and said I need to transfer somewhere where that that has a decent film school. I mean, so she was like, okay, well, she looked it up. She said, well, there's three choices basically: USC, UCLA, or NYU on the East Coast. And I knew I didn't want to go on the East Coast. I was a Westerner at heart, and I was the West is the best, as Jim Morrison said for me. Um, so I just flipped a coin and I applied to USC. and I got accepted. And my application landed on the desk at the perfect time because in those days, USC was really looking to expand their student body in terms of film beyond, like sons and daughters of the movie
Yeah.
executives. They were really wanting to regionally reach out and bring different voices in from around the country to their film school. And I was just one of those applicants that they thought, oh, this is okay, let's bring this guy in. And so, yeah, I got accepted into USC Film School. I went down there, and it was awesome because suddenly this little niche that I had loved and was passionate about since I was 9 years old became my world. Became my world. I got to talk film 24/7 with people that understood and loved it too, and and so it was really just a very cool time. And while there, in my first year, I had to take an elective, and there was a screenwriting class that was, a part of that. And I thought, well, I'm going to take that because I like writing, I like telling stories, and so that's really where it all came together. Because in that class, but if you're lucky in the course of your schooling, you have somebody take an interest in you
Yeah.
and mentor you or just, encourage you. And I had that in a professor in that class who took me aside and said, look, you really show an aptitude for this. And if, you really want to direct movies, which I did, he said the quickest way to get into the director's chair is to be able to write good screenplays. And so I took him at his word, and yeah.
The
I
rest
think
is
I too
history.
much at his word in his for him is because I dropped out shortly thereafter of USC because it was a very expensive school, and I knew people, I knew guys with bachelor degrees and some even with MFAs in film that were tending bar. Like they were, after all that money they spent, they had a nice reel of film under their arm, but they were just, they were. And I thought, well, fuck it, I can work, in a, I don't want to attend a bar, but I could work at a, some sort of low life job and write scripts and try
Sure.
to, get in that way. And that's what I ended up doing.
Well, I'm curious in that aspect, and you've said this in other interviews you've done. A lot of times, parents have an idea of what they want their kids to do, or what they think their kids would be good, without any input on their own kids. And seeing as though your parents, although like probably some of that generation had no idea or concept of the film industry, were supportive of you, and then you had that professor, even with dropping out of the USC Film School, how much did those two instances of your parents believing you and the professor believing you help you just full steam ahead in terms of not stopping with your dream of writing and producing films?
Well, it certainly made it easier on some level for me to pursue. But you have to understand. I mean, at that time of my life, I was quite naive too. I mean, I just thought, "Fuck, somebody's got to do this. I'm going to do it." Kind of that. But it was great to have my parents in that moment when I told them that's what I wanted to do, not try to talk me out of it because
Sure.
they were just concerned and they were fearful of what that, you know, they just didn't know anything. So I was very lucky in that you're right. I mean, a lot of well-meaning parents can talk their children out of their dreams, because they just don't know, or they fear, or they're concerned about this, that, and in my case, a lot of parents would say, "Well, that's great that you have it. Why don't you finish that degree though? And then when you've done with that, if you still feel the same way, yes, we'll support.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that. So I was very fortunate that my parents said, "Hey, whatever it takes, we'll support you. I mean, we'll support your, efforts. We don't know anything about it, nothing about it. Crazy, kind of sounding to us, but we trust you, and away you go. So that was great. And then to have my screenwriting professor take me aside and just give me a little boost of like, hey, you should do this because you're good at it, really was helpful to me. So
Well, I want to talk about that. I mean, nowadays with social media, you can get noticed very quickly with YouTube putting something out there and it blows up, and you can get all this attention from people. Whereas when you were growing up and or any other generation, there was of course no YouTube, no TikTok, none of that stuff. So you really have to pay your dues, I'm sure, in the industry of eventually getting to a spot where you can sort of be fine early in your career. I know you mentioned you took a job, a low level job where you could write at the same time for scripts and stuff. Was there a moment, even maybe when you were working for Paramount or then eventually Disney, where you were writing and it tested you in terms of if this is really what you want to do, or were you somebody that was full into everything?
well, again, I would just say that I was naive, and I just thought I'm going to do this, and somebody's got to do this. In a year, a movie's going to come out, and somebody's going to have written it. Why not me? So I didn't know any better about how hard it is and all those things. Uh, I just assumed that I was going to make it in a weird way. I don't.
Sure.
I'm not trying to be, arrogant or about it or anything. But I just in my body, I just thought this is what I'm supposed to do, and I'm going to do it no matter how long it takes. And that was the attitude I always had. And I got some jobs, and then there were setbacks. After I wrote my second script at Paramount, I was on unemployment for a year. So I think what a lot of people who want to get into the movie business, especially as screenwriters, assume is that they just focus so much on I got to get that I got to get hired, I got to get my script read, and I got to get that job, and that's great, and you do have to do those things, but most careers in Hollywood in terms of screenwriting are careers that are just filled with ups and downs and ups and downs, and if you're not ready and you don't understand that that is probably going to be how your career goes, unless you're the one half of 1% that just uh, then it's tough for a lot of people. I think they get to a place and they go, "Wow, this is not what I signed up for." A lot of people, the majority of people, need some sort of security in their life. And screenwriting as a career is not necessarily uh, uh, built on security.
Sure.
We're in the midst of a strike right now,
Yeah.
5 months now, just for that reason, because a lot of new writers are getting to a point where they thought, wait a minute, I'm working on this hit show, I'm writing on this hit show, and where's all the things that I thought would be available to me? Like, I'm going to make some decent money, I'm going to be able to buy a house, raise a family. None of that stuff is available. In fact, some people on these hit shows, they would, you've heard these stories, had to even take second jobs just
Yeah.
to make their rent. And so that is why this strike is going on right now. Because when I broke in the '80s, you know, um, it was certainly a different model. There was, the studios, the 6 or 7 studios, I can't remember how many there were. They were the ones that developed all of the movies that made it to the screen, and they would release 20 movies a year, and they would be developing 150 more at any given time. So you multiply that times 7, and there was it was a little clique of screenwriters back in those days. I don't want to say little, but certainly over the last 20 years, many, many more influx of WGA members. We've seen an increase of people gravitating towards writing. But in those days, there was plenty of work to be
Yeah.
found. There was plenty of work out there, whether you were pitching on a project, or you were going to do a rewrite of a project, or you were going to do a polish of a project, or you were in my case when Disney came knocking, and I ended up writing the Hunchback of Notre Dame for them. Subsequently, they offered me a multi-year deal. uh, those kinds of things are not available to
Sure.
most writers these days, and there's a lot of good writers out there too, and so it's really something that the companies have to figure out a way to they can't be making billions off of
Yeah,
screenwriters who can't even make their rent.
sure.
So yeah, times have definitely changed since I broke in. And so my point is, I made decent money, and I wrote and directed a movie during that time, and I got another deal at I think it was Sony, blind script deals, which are just not given out as much anymore. Blind script deals, meaning, hey, we're just going to, put you on a retainer like a lawyer.
Sure.
We're going to pay you a lot of money, and then you're going to figure out what we're going to all figure out together what you write for us. So yeah, it's definitely I feel for a lot of young writers right now coming up. And looking around at the landscape and going, what the fuck? I mean, I can't even pay my rent and I'm writing on a hit show. I mean, that's crazy.
I want to talk about a film of yours that came out 35 years ago this year, being Gorillas in the Mist, a film that, looking with today's lens in the landscape of animals and the population of the African wildlife nowadays, and how it's decreasing for the most part. Back then, though, being part of that film, how important was that to your career, looking back at all these years later?
Well, that was a definite turning point. That was a huge turning point. And, it was also, I don't know whether, I don't know if you want to say fate or destiny, but a lot of the projects that I've been lucky enough to work on over the course of my career, I feel like have been either drawn to me or I've been drawn to them because of where I grew up, how I grew up, what I loved growing up, the passion I had for camping and backpacking and fishing and hunting and all these things that I did as a sort of like I was raised in a culture of the outdoors, of wilderness, and appreciating wildlife and things like that. Um, so when Gorillas in the Mist came along, it was like smack dab right in the, like right in my wheelhouse, like that project. I've always successfully over the course of my career, in many instances, written strong female characters. I've had great success writing strong female characters, and I attribute that because I had strong female characters in my life. I had my grandmother who was, pioneer stock and just, great, took care of a family of six and raised worked in the gardens and did all her. My grandfather was a logger, so he was gone half the time. She was a strong woman, and my mother, ultimately was a strong woman as well. Strong in many ways of keeping the family going. My dad was gone, like my grandmother's husband was gone. My mother's husband, my dad, was gone at a pivotal time. He flew for the Air Force, and he, got called to active duty in Vietnam. So he was gone for many, a couple of years. He would only come home once a month for just a few days, And then my mother was raising five kids. So I think that sort of that I don't know. My attitude towards women has always been not sort of the frail,
Yeah,
kind of, like because I was not surrounded by women like that. I was surrounded by women who said, "Okay, we got shit to do. Let's get it done. Come on, boom, boom,
yeah,
boom." Like you know, army generals in
yeah,
some ways. That didn't mean that they weren't nurturing and loving, but it was, boy, when you got an order, you jumped.
yeah,
Whether it was your grandmother or your mother. And but they also had a very strong sense of right and wrong, and all those things sort of informed. So when Gorillas in the Mist came along, and I'd been aware of Diane Fossey because I was a big fan of Richard Leakey, and Leakey had taken, of course, oh. The woman that studied chimpanzees at Gombe, Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall, Diane was part of that trifecta. Jane Goodall, Diane, Birute Galdicus down in Borneo, I think, studying orangutan. So he had sort of like found these women who were tough and strong and independent to go into the jungles or wherever to study these great apes. Uh, and I just thought, well, I know that character. I know her. And I know, like, I know how, like, I just had an instinct. Plus, I also knew that I loved wildlife and that I could
Sure.
relate to her journey and her ultimate commitment to stop poaching of these wonderful animals.
Yeah.
So when I got asked to do that, I was that was just that was I wrote that script in 2.5 weeks.
Wow.
I just knew it. I knew it so well. I had a couple of documentaries that I used as source
Yeah.
material. I had an article that had just been written in Life magazine about Diane. She had just been murdered like 6 months before.
Yeah.
Uh, so and that's why nobody tried telling her story before then, because ironically, her murder was the end of the movie. Really, I mean, suddenly there was a movie there.
Yeah.
In a weird way. So yeah, no, I wrote that in 2.5 weeks, and the producers turned it into Warner Brothers, where they had a deal. Warner Brothers loved it, committed to make it, and yeah. Anyway, it was a great time for me in terms of then they went off and made the movie. I got nominated for an Academy Award along with Anna Hamilton Phelan, who had written a draft, several drafts for Universal, who actually had the rights to Diane's book. So those two companies merged to make one movie. Um, and from then on, um, you get an Academy Award nomination, and
Yeah. Doors
suddenly
open.
you're suddenly you're in a room with people who can say yes to the movie, like green light or yes, and
Sure.
give you the job right there in the room, not in sort of junior executive
Yeah.
land where they may love it, but they got to send it upstairs and you got to go up the ladder, pitch, and all that stuff. So that was a huge turning point for me in my career. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask you about the writing process, but you kind of mentioned that a lot of the other, some of the Disney films, of course, Hunchback and Atlantis, and of course Tarzan, the stories of that have been told before, whether it's from a book or from a television series or whatever the case may be. Whereas this one, as you said, there wasn't really a story told about her. There was an article written about her scenario. So for you, in terms of obviously you want to make it as realistic as possible, but also have some creative elements, I'm sure, in the film to tell a story. What was your process diving between both things of telling the true story, but also making it a movie where people could be entertained?
Well, it really starts with research. If you're gonna tell a story about somebody who is a real life character, before you start inventing a bunch of stuff, a bunch of scenes that are entertaining, you really have to do your research, because anything you invent for whatever reason has to feel organic to the character, has to feel organic to what happened. A lot of times, in the course of making a film or writing a film, the true events are spread out and you have to squash timelines, or
Sure.
there's 6 characters that were meaningful that you have to just create one character to be symbolic of all
Yeah.
those other 6 so there's all sorts of decisions that have to be made. Um, but like, I think we had the rights to Bob Campbell, who was the National Geographic photographer on the mountain with Diane. The Universal writer and Universal did not have his rights. So I was able to construct a script that was very true to sort of everything I had read up to that point. And, unfortunately, I mean, like, there is speculation, and there maybe had been an affair between Diane and Bob Campbell, who was married on the mountain, but I didn't put that in the script. I made them working partners,
Sure.
trying to do the right thing by these gorillas, and et cetera, et cetera. When the projects merged to become one, Universal decided that, and the director also, who I met with, that we can't show these two people not fucking on the mountaintop. Okay, Michael. Anyway, so that's fine. But yeah, I mean, it's you have to always be telling a story that you hope people are interested in and are hooked by and want to see what's going to happen. I think, the 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 ace in the hole on gorillas is were the gorillas themselves.
Sure.
They were extremely. I mean, I went to Rwanda and I saw them and I sat with them and I looked in their eyes, and there is something so human. I mean, we share so much DNA with that species,
Yeah.
and so I think that really became something that, that, and Diane's initial wonder and discovery, and then kind of crossing the line of studying to becoming a little too sort of like intimate with them and allowing them to, like touching the. I mean, any scientist will tell you that she did absolutely the wrong thing, like in terms of like letting herself get emotionally attached to them,
Yeah.
but how could you not? And so
Sure.
I felt like that was a very empathetic thing about Diane's character, was that as much as, and she was, in all fairness to her, she was not a trained scientist who could,
Sure.
just keep her emotions in check and just look at them as subjects and record data and not be, not touch them. And, she was a woman who had previously, worked with, I think, autistic children. I could be wrong, but so she had a great deal of empathy, already as a character, and so when I kept reading about her, I mean, she started to look at some of these gorillas, especially the young ones, as her children, or as
Yeah.
children that she became close to and watched grow up in her time on the mountain, which is why she became so strident about, and almost, like insane about
Yeah.
protecting them, So, and I understood that character, whether you agreed with her methodology or not, I totally understood how she could get to that place.
After that, of course, you had the last of Dogman that you were that yeah, that you wrote. But then after that film, or maybe even during near the end of that, because of course it's not like you just write a screenplay and then oh that's gonna go into production and then that doesn't take that short amount of time. There's years that go into it. Of course, eventually you would work with Disney for 10 years and you joined them at a period when, although since the beginning, since Snow White, they've been known for their animated films, even when it was by hand, on how gold standard it was in terms of production, the story. When you were getting ready to be part of Hunchback, did that ever hold weight in terms of your potential writing that movie, or was that something that just was in the background that you didn't really pay attention to?
Well, it's interesting because initially I did not. I mean, just to understand a part of the timeline, the very first jobs I got were a couple of scripts I wrote at Paramount, and I, made some friends, executives there, and I knew Jeffrey Katzenberg and a couple other executives. And from the time I finished those scripts to getting busy, trying to get Blast the Dogman made and other projects, those guys, including Michael Eisner, shifted to Disney. And Jeffrey Katzenberg took over the animation division. And so his idea was to develop uh, screenplays for the stories that they would make into animated movies. Now, that had not been done. And traditionally, most of the animated movies were developed in house by story artists, animators, etc. And yeah, ultimately there was writing done, of course, but Jeffrey wanted to bring kind of a live action sensibility to the development of the animated movies that, in his division. So he was reaching out to writers he knew that he had worked with, that he liked, and I just happened to be one of them. And initially, though, I kept saying no because not no because I didn't want to write for Disney, but there was a certain part of Disney that, the true renaissance of Disney animation was just getting started, and I think Little Mermaid had just been
Yeah.
released. And I still really considered those movies for kids. And
Yeah.
it wasn't that I didn't want to write for Disney. It's just that I had this vision of myself as being a more serious
Sure.
writer who wanted to write adult, movies and, whatever. So, and I was also at the time trying to get Last of the Dogman financed and off the ground and etc. So I had a lot of stuff on my plate when he, through his executives, kept reaching out to me saying, "Why don't you come in? Why don't you come in and see what we have?" And I kept saying no, and I went to lunch with one executive at one point who said, "Hey, we have this movie we're doing. It's going to be our first computer generated movie. We just bought this company called Pixar in Marin County." And and I said, "Well, what's the story? I mean, that's always the most important thing to
Yeah.
me." And she said, "It's a story about a boy and his talking toys." And I was just like, "Oh man!" So that was an easy pass for me. Uh, in addition to the fact that they said if you're interested and it works out, you'd have to move to Marin County for 2 years. You know,
Yeah.
and I just like and I was trying to get a movie off the ground. I wanted to direct, so that was an easy pass. Of course, hindsight is 2020,
Yeah.
as we all know. But eventually, I got my movie financed, but I had this window where the star Tom Berenger had to do two other movies before he could do mine. So, and like all writers, blue collar writers, screenwriters in Hollywood, I had to pay my bills. I had so right around that time, Disney reached out again and said, "Why don't you come in and look at see what we're working on? Just come on." And I said, "Okay, I need money. I have this 8 month window." So I went in, and that meeting turned into the Hunchback of Notre
Yeah.
Dame. So
Well, with that film though, I mean that there's a book, Victor Hugo's book of the Hunchback of Notre Dame has, I'm sure, a lot of detail in it, but also story and from beginning to end. With the magnitude that that book holds and the history of it and the story, what made that exciting to want to take that book and turn it into a film? Where is that something you were interested in as a child, or was it just something that was a challenge for you that you were willing to take on?
well, I think a little bit of both because the truth is I was a monster nerd in the
Yeah.
'60s growing up. I collected a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. I loved horror movies, monster movies, any kind of spooky, scary movies. I just was fixated on, and so I was keenly aware of the story of Quasimodo because in those days, in the '60s, he was sort of lumped in with that great canon of universal
Yeah.
horror monsters: Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, Hunchback. Even though Quasimodo was human, he was still sort of like that rogues gallery of monsters from Universal. And so I was well aware of that story. Um, so when in that meeting, when they, I went through a lot of material that they were trying to develop, and none of it was resonating with me. Then they said toward the end of the meeting, we're trying to figure out if there's a Disney animated movie in this, and this turned out to be Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame. I didn't even hesitate. I said, "I'll do that. I'll do that. I want to do that." And it was like just a total, like, again, just like Gorillas was right in my wheelhouse. Hunchback was just a total, like the arrow to the bullseye of what,
Mm.
my childhood. And I thought, no, I don't know if I can do this or what it means, but I have to say yes. And so I did. And then, it was a great, I'm just, it was a great experience. It was probably the most creative fun I've had to that point as a screenwriter, and would continue. I mean, it would continue after Hunchback into Tarzan, which again spoke directly to my childhood.
Sure.
I grew up on Johnny Weissmuller movies. So, I mean, I just, so here I was being handed by Disney opportunities to really just, express creatively everything I was about, you know. And that included Atlantis,
Yeah.
which was, I loved adventure films, and, Kurt, Gary, Don, and I, the brain trust behind Hunchback, got together, and they had amassed enough cachet at the studio by then to do pretty much whatever they wanted. And we all decided we wanted to do an adventure movie. We wanted to do something with no songs, something different. And we got to, I got to cook up the initial story, and we had a great time on that film. And then again, Brother Bear was something I was asked to do, and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I'm
Yeah.
a I'm a huge student of Native culture, so every one of those Disney movies meant something to me,
Sure.
far deeper than just here's a job, you want to do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So
Well, I wanted to speak about Tarzan. At first, I want to ask though, how does it feel to be one of the main people to help Phil Collins revitalize his career in the '90s, with what came from that, but also with that film, and I'll probably revisit this in a little bit. Both films, whether it be Hunchback, Atlantis, Tarzan, both very detailed in both its surrounding what the film looks like in terms of the design of it, but also the story itself. With those films, you also were collaborating on. You mentioned Kirk and several others from that movie from Hunchback that were with Atlantis, but also there were some from Tarzan they worked on with the previous film as well. When you're able to collaborate with others from previous movies on a following one, does that make the process for creating this story in this film easier or different?
well, I mean, I think it gives a level of comfort to me as the writer to know that no matter what, like I knew early on when I went to work at Disney that I was going to have to bring my A game constantly,
Sure.
always, because I was surrounded by some of the most talented artists, designers, directors, this and that. Disney amassed A+ talent, and
Yeah.
that's, so I knew initially I was intimidated, but then as I got sort of comfortable and uh, I knew that no matter every movie I started for them, that there were 300 people working on a movie that were going to have my back,
Yeah.
basically, you know, because I didn't have to worry about doing their jobs, and they didn't have to worry about me doing my job. They trusted that I would, deliver a story that would inspire them to bring their expertise and their talent to
Sure.
the whole endeavor. So it was a give and take, and it was just so much fun to be in rooms with artists, and story artists and storyboard artists, and and riffing on ideas, and as opposed to being in, kind of a meeting with suits at a studio giving you notes on your script, which didn't make any sense half the time. So that's why I kept saying yes. And in addition to the material, was that I just had such a great time doing those movies,
Sure.
working those movies.
Well,
So,
I want to mention that you talked about getting notes from suits, but then also sitting with these really creative people and riffing off of ideas. And a lot of Disney's films up until Atlantis had a lot of song and dance in it, and that was the root of a lot of the films. Particularly, you saw with Hunchback, there were singing there, but in Atlantis, there was not. When you're writing we're writing those films, how much did you imagine those elements in it, or were you something that just had a blank space and just writing until you were done and thought it made sense?
well, I had the same question early on in Hunchback. I knew it was going to be a musical, and I was like, guys, do I have to write songs? Because I suck at that, probably. And he's like, no, they won't. Don't worry about that, Tab. You write the stories. You write the story you want to write, and we will, Steve Schwartz and Alan Menken will go through and find places for songs in your script.
Yeah,
They will read it, be inspired, and say this is a song, and that exactly happened. One day I was called in, and my script had been put up on one big wall in this meeting room, and Alan Menken and Steve Schwartz went through it, reading the script, and then they would stop. I think Alan had a pointer. He'd point song, and then Steven would come up with a big, Sharpie, and he'd start Xing out pages of my script. And I was like, holy fuck. I worked so hard on that dialogue, and at one point, Alan turned around, he saw me, and he goes, Tab, no, don't worry. This is you're gonna love it. These your words are what inspires these songs, and we're gonna, and willing, like all this stuff, and then, but ultimately, when I saw the film, oh my God, I just was like, of course, this is way better than anything I could
Sure.
have imagined, and they told the story, they continued the story through the songs, and
Yeah.
so, yeah, no, it was a great process, and one that once I got used to, I mean, but you're right, I mean, and Tarzan had songs as well, and I didn't work with Phil on Tarzan, and I didn't, but I had a I met him because we were invited to an awards ceremony. I think one of those ones in LA where you're told you've already won, so show up and collect your prize. And so Phil and I were sitting at the same table, and he had just finished Brother Bear, and so we had a nice chat. He was very, very complimentary about both the scripts for Tarzan and Brother Bear that inspired his songs, and that's what any artist who's coming in to write songs for a story, they're hoping to be inspired by what's on the page already. So
Speaking of that element, and I mentioned Atlantis had none of that aspect, and there was a quote that you said in a previous interview where the message was less songs and more explosions. With a film like Atlantis, where you're eliminating that whole aspect of the song and dance number, and you're just able to be completely creative and tell the story, for you growing up with all the films that you watched, the process it took you to get to where you were, to have that opportunity to just have this massive playground and write a story your own way, how freeing was that?
oh, it was awesome, dude. Are you kidding me? It was like I was like a kid in a candy store. We all were. Kirk, Gary, Don. Um, it's you have to understand that the movies I wrote during that era for Disney was going through something of a metamorphosis, and they were really trying to be open to different uh, ideas, different material. Um, I think they had grown a little tired of the fairy tale musical,
Yeah,
and so they were just more open to different ideas, which included Hunchback, which Tarzan, um, and certainly Atlantis. So I was very fortunate, that I was in the right place at the right time to write those four movies, or write on those, because many people contributed to the writing of those movies. Trust me. But I was very fortunate that I was, you know, and I look back and I'm very proud of those four movies, because I don't think in the case of Hunchback, I don't think Disney would make that movie today. That was of a time and a place when they were really trying to stretch uh, creatively. And, I've said this before, and, we got away with murder on Hunchback. I mean, there's so many, I mean, I get a kick out of fans who watched that movie as a kid and laughed at the gargoyles and were inspired by Esmeralda and this and that, and then they watch it again as an adult and they text me and like, "What the fuck, Tab? What were you doing in that scene with us?" Like, hey, you know what? It's So I mean, we had yeah, there were things when I wrote on that movie that I thought in a million years this is ever going to make it in the movie, and it did.
yeah.
And that was, I think, that is exactly a testament to where Disney was at in terms of like trying to figure out where they were going to go and how they were going to go and what their future and storytelling was going to look like. Um, so anyway, yeah, it was Atlantis was just a joy from beginning to end. You know.
Well, similar to Hunchback and Tarzan, I couldn't think of the word for a second. Atlantis set at a certain period in time, a period of peace in the early 1900s, when technology was starting to boom yet again. As a writer, how important is that to find the right time period for the movie instead of just writing it in current 21st century?
Well, it's very important, and like for instance, Hunchback had I didn't have to do any world building in
Yeah,
Hunchback. I mean, the time period, the Notre Dame, Paris, the catacombs, so many things were already there and
Yeah.
available that I didn't have to create, which was great because I could, spend a lot of time on character, defining characters and massaging the story in a way that could be, would work as a Disney animated feature. Uh, with, with Atlantis, we were starting from scratch,
Yeah.
zero. But we weren't really because, Atlantis represents a lot of movies that we watched as kids that we loved. We, there's a lot of tropes that we early on stole, not stole, but, were inspired by. Let me put it that way. But, ultimately we had to create a world. We had to create the world. And so everything in a Disney animated movie, everything in every frame is intentional. I mean, there is no sort of like, oh, the background people, just whatever. No, everything, every color, every whatever anybody's wearing, and the color there, everything is intentional. So everything in the creation of Atlantis was intentional, including the time period. For that reason,
Sure.
we wanted to tell a story that was on the that had the nostalgic sort of old world flavor, but was on the verge of that, of the time period, on the verge of technology, mainly because Kirk and Gary wanted to create all these cool vehicles that they could
Yeah.
take under the earth and plow through shit and everything. So there was this whole desire in terms of production design to create, these vehicles that they would take under the earth. And I think the time period also worked because it, like a lot of people feel like the world has already been explored. There's nothing new out there.
Sure.
There's nothing to learn. And by setting it in 1914, we set it in an era where there were still possibilities of
Yeah.
lost civilizations, and the whole character of Milo. I mean, he was originally he was going to be a Viking, so his name was Milo Ericsson, and he was a descendant of Leif Erikson. And then he was going to be a descendant of Blackbeard the pirate, so he was Milo something or other. I can't even remember. But we finally just decided to make him a linguist who just had this, had discovered and was just trying to find the Shepherd's Journal to, sort of unlock the mystery of whatever happened to
Sure.
Atlantis, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then I thought, well, what should we call him? Well, let's just call him Milo Thatch because Thatch sounded like a cool the bad guy would
Yeah.
call him occasionally, and so we settled on that. But yeah, no, it was great because and by then the directors and the producer trusted me, and so I initially, I mean, we had determined that we wanted to tell a story about explorers going into the earth and finding what we didn't even know. We just knew that we could say, okay, this is written in stone, a story about explorers going into the earth. Well, I mean that's so general. I mean,
Sure.
it's been done before, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and other like you could even say the horror movie Descent from a few years ago is women going in, spelunking into the earth, and of course they have a whole different set of problems. But so that wasn't, there was nothing fresh and new about that. What became fresh and new about it is all the things that we added to that.
Sure.
All of the from the time period, from the cast of explorers, the characters I came up with, which, by the way, you can look back at that movie now and say, in some ways, wow, they were really ahead of their time. They had
Yeah.
the explorers were diverse. There was, well, we had nobody telling us we had to be diverse,
Yeah.
like today.
Yeah.
We just did it. We just did
Sure.
it because we just thought, hey, we want an international group of explorers, and we just did it. So I came up with Vinny. I came up with Audrey. I came up with, and I didn't even think twice about it. Audrey's Latina. Okay. Benny is an Italian demolitions expert. Okay. Dr. Sweet, like we just, I didn't, nobody even questioned it. We just like, oh, this is cool. These are great characters. Let's keep going. So, so that was cool. And even Princess Kita being a princess of color was not something we even thought of, like, oh, we're breaking ground here. Yes, let's do it. We never thought of it that way.
Sure.
We just thought of, Atlanteans probably we're people of, we're either brown or black,
Yeah.
we're people of some color. So that would just made sense that Kita would, be that. And Kita was never meant to be a princess anyway, even though she is, and I refer to her the Princess of Atlantis in early drafts of the treatment, because the more we got into it, I mean, she was a warrior princess,
Yeah.
and in fact, the first scene that I wrote of her meeting with Milo was he is kind of wandered away from the group,
Yeah.
and he's suddenly under attack by this big fucking caterpillar creature, that's kind of right out of First Men in the Moon, if you ever saw that movie. And it's just about to chomp him with these mandibles, and he's like, ah, and then it drops dead right in front of him, and he's like, and then he looks up, and there's Kita standing on top of this dead thing with a
Yeah.
spear in it. She takes it out, and she looks down at him, and he's like, like that was how they were supposed to meet. Like she was a hunter, a warrior, So again, very tough but vulnerable woman,
Sure.
So that's how we wanted to always portray her. So anyway, so yeah, it evolved, it evolved, it evolved. It always evolves, and always, the writing process of getting to a place where everybody feels good about the story can take anywhere from 6 months to a year.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I wrote on Hunchback for probably a year, and it's interesting because unlike live action movies, where the screenplay is king, screenplay. Everything comes from the screenplay, the director, the actors, and this and that. You don't even write the script until long. The outline or the treatment is king in animation,
Okay.
right? So that's where you figure. I mean, I turned in a 25-page treatment to Hunchback after working on it for 3 months. And Jeffrey Katzenberg called me and says, "I love this. I'm greenlighting it off the treatment, and we're going." I mean, and I was like, "Wow, that's awesome." So a lot of work can get started before you even write fade in exterior Notre Dame Cathedral Day. I mean, that comes way down the line, which was a big change for me.
Sure.
Yeah. So, but the other part of that was cool was that I got to exercise a muscle I rarely got to exercise as a screenwriter, which is writing prose, which is what my first love was back in middle school and high school.
The last movie I want to mention to you before we sort of wrap up here is another movie that's celebrating an anniversary, which is Brother Bear, which I remember seeing 20 years ago in the theater. I don't remember the whole movie because I was only 3 years old, but I remember sitting in the IMAX theater with family friends and watching it. And I remember, of course, the McDonald's toys and so forth. Another film similar to Gorillas in the Mist, where it has a lot of importance in terms of course, Native Americans, or not Native Americans, but the Inuit type of
Indigenous
indigenous
culture, yes.
culture and believing in another universe and that sort of thing and a higher power. With that film being the tail end of your time with Disney, what was that experience like for you writing it, especially with stuff that had so much importance to certain cultures in the world?
Well, it was again just as I was off Atlantis, I think Tom Schumacher called me and said, "Look, we got a animator who's going to make his directing debut, and he has a story about he wants to tell about a man turning into a bear and learning a great lesson in life." And and that's all he had to say because I love bears. I mean, so that director was Aaron Blaise, wonderful guy, and the caveat though was that they were going to make the film in Orlando. at their facility in Orlando, which meant that I had to make a lot of cross country plane flights back in the day, and I was helping raise, 5 kids by that point. So that was a bit of uh, it just made things a little bit more difficult, but the experience itself was absolutely awesome. Aaron is a very talented wildlife illustrator, painter, and he had done character work on Mulan and other. I can't remember his. You'd have to look his credits up, but he was just really talented. But beyond that, when he and I met, I mean, within 5 minutes, we just knew we were like brothers.
Sure.
And, because he just loved wildlife, he loved wilderness, he loved native culture, all the things that I loved. So much of those early meetings were us sitting around a campfire at his house, can't remember the name of the lake outside of Orlando, and just shooting the shit, just talking about stuff we love, and then talking about the story. I want to, like, he hadn't really worked out too much, so I was, called in to help him shape the movie and find the story, and it became a story about brothers. It became, obviously. But it was an exciting time, and I worked on that probably, I don't know, close to a year, I guess, back and forth. And then he came out to Burbank, and we had the pitch to Roy Disney, like, but it was great. I remember he made that the hand imprint with the bear, in the bear with the hand imprint. He drew that, in a meeting one day, and he held it up, and I said, "That is fucking awesome, dude." And that was early on in the process, and that illustration survived all the way through.
Wow.
And a lot of things don't survive
Sure.
initially; they change or whatever. So no, I had a great time working with Aaron and helping to find the story, and just spending time in Orlando in meetings and just really talking through things. It's always that's and then writing there's outline after outline and treatment after treatment and all that's the usual stuff,
Sure.
you know.
Last time we spoke, I mentioned the influence some of the major films you were part of in my life, but of course, as others as well. And I remember, of course, going to theaters 20 years ago, seeing Brother Bear, Atlantis. Whatever state of consciousness I'm in, Atlantis is always near the top of viewing stuff.
Awesome.
I'm curious for you, going back at that time once you finished those projects all those years ago, compared to now, how you looked at it.
How I look at those projects?
Yeah.
Well, I look at those projects as a huge chunk of my career. The 12 years, I was working on those 4 films, and they were some of the most gratifying, creatively inspiring, most fun one could have as a screenwriter.
Yeah.
That is how I look at those. All those movies have a very special meaning to me. Uh, and they came at a time in my career when you know, I I just wanted to be a good screenwriter, and I wanted to tell great stories. And suddenly, almost like divine intervention, I was offered Hunchback, which we talked about. I was I knew that story at 9 years old because I was a monster nerd, growing up in the '60s. So every one of those films has a special place in my heart, absolutely. And it was a great 12 years working with some of the most talented people
Sure.
in the world of animation in those days, and it just was a joy, a purely joy. It was a lot of fun.
Even though back then Atlantis might not have done financially as well as maybe others that you're part of, but even 20 years later, I mean, it's still beloved. It's still held in a limelight, which is unbelievable in the sense because in the early 90s, I mean, you had Little Mermaid, you had Beauty and the Beast, films who are such historically talented films, and you just continue to build. So I'm sure even though you're the story guy creating this emotional aspect, it's still a challenging thing. I was I was thinking the last few weeks of sort of when I end up wanting to wrap this up because nothing lasts forever, and I was thinking of reviewing films and TV series and music and so forth, and I was scrolling through IMDb's list of top movies that were all the way back from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and ones that I guess considered classics or legendary. And seeing as you've been part of this industry for 40 years, what do you consider? What's on your list in terms of having to be considered a classic or legendary film?
Well, I mean, most of those films. Look, there's two parts to that question. I would answer that as a kid,
Yeah,
the movies that influenced me that I saw. I would probably start with Wizard of Oz. So I mean, I grew up in a different era. And then as I got older, I started to see, that I went through kind of that youth movement in Hollywood that began with Easy Rider in the late 60s, continued through the mid to late 70s. I saw all those movies on the big screen, and I was just knocked out by time and again by movies like The Godfather and Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I mean, Taxi Driver, and I mean, just great young filmmakers just bursting onto the scene
sure,
and showing us things we'd never seen before because it was Hollywood was evolving, it was changing.
sure,
There were now you could put things on the screen that you couldn't put on the screen in the early 60s or mid
sure,
60s even. So there was I don't want to say a permissiveness, but there was just this new crop of filmmakers that were willing to look at the world realistically
sure.
with violence and sex and things at their fingertips that they couldn't have done in the 60s. And so we got such great movies as a result of that. So those are so I would say there were two waves, the films of my youth and the films of my young adulthood that absolutely influenced me to this day.
Now, of course, recently the news broke out that the Writers Guild and the studios met and had or put a deal in place, and now it's back to business for the writers as the actors are still looking for a fair deal and deservedly. So, you know, back to work, back on working on future projects, and as I mentioned,
Right.
the anniversary of this year is for you in the business. Of course, you're not putting the screen down and stop typing, but when that day comes when you're no longer creating wonderful stories, being part of that element, what do you hope the screenwriter legacy is for yourself?
Well, first of all, you know, I'm always going to write because it's my passion.
Sure.
So I may not be writing as a screenwriter for hire or for money ultimately down the
Sure.
road, but I'll always be writing. Maybe my writing will shift to something else more reflective and I'll write a
Yeah.
book. I don't know. Who knows? Uh, but I guess, when I think about, I don't think about it too much. I mean, obviously, the thing that that immediately leaps out is this legacy of these four animated Disney films, that I wrote, that have had a profound effect on a lot of people, that I was kind of frankly unaware of. But I find out almost every day how a movie like Hunchback or Atlantis or even Brother Bear inspired, people like I was inspired
Yeah.
watching The Wizard of Oz, right? This is their Wizard of Oz. These movies was their Wizard of Oz in terms of like growing up with them, and I think I'm very proud of the fact that for the most part I wrote very strong female characters in these movies, and
Yeah.
so young girls especially, and young teenage girls as well, uh, were inspired by a character like Esmeralda. We're inspired by, you know, even Jane and Tarzan, and certainly the female characters of Atlantis.
Yeah.
Whether it was Princess Kida or Audrey or even you know um, what's her name?
Miss Packard.
Well, Packard, yeah, but no, I'm thinking of the blonde.
Oh,
God, I can't even remember my own
Helga.
characters. Helga, yeah, even her, in a weird. way, even though she was kind of villainous at the end, she takes down Rourke. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a lot for people to process in terms of these characters. They think they're one way, and then they find out, oh, there's humanity there. Esmeralda's just a dancer until she stands up to Frollo and demands justice
Yeah.
for people. I mean, so there's a lot going on in those films. So yeah, I would say that probably, because I don't determine my legacy, dude.
Sure.
I mean, others will,
Yeah.
and so I would imagine that those movies will probably be my legacy in terms of just immediate recognition. Tab
Oh yeah.
Murphy, oh, Disney, those films. But I'm proud of many other films that I worked on. Gorillas in the Mist.
Yeah.
I received an Academy Award nomination for that. I wrote and directed a movie very near and dear to my heart called Last of the Dogman, which is, again, just sort of emblematic of everything I'm about, including native culture and things like that. So, yeah, I hope that, maybe my career will be taken as a whole, but my guess is most people will zone in on the Disney movies.
Well, a lot of stuff that has cultural significance that people may not realize from a grand standpoint, but as they get older, they realize, oh, this is what it meant, and this is still prevalent to this day. Before we end here, I want to say, Tab, thank you for of course, this is one shot. We just changed clothes because we've been
Yeah,
speaking
yeah, there
forever.
you go.
Thank you for your patience and doing this with me. I want to end on a little segment called the one word challenge. So what entails with
Sure.
this is that I'll throw out a few names of people, places, or things, and you have to do your best to say a word or two or a sentence that best comes to mind when you hear it.
Okay.
First one, Tacoma, Washington.
My birthplace.
Los Angeles.
Uh, a necessary evil.
Writing.
Joy,
Creativity.
passion, uh, creativity. The same thing when it's working. When it's not, it's a dark place.
Hard work.
Necessary.
Success.
Overrated in the sense of what most people consider success.
Sure. Milo J. Thatch.
Partially my alter ego.
And last but certainly never least, this cosmic universe we all call Earth that we live in, Charles Tab Murphy.
Uh, just trying to live authentically and be an honest storyteller.
Well, when you write films like Atlantis, Tarzan, and many more, it's hard to not do that. I want to say thank you so much for doing this, taking the time and sharing your life, because I know you've done this many times before, but it's always great to talk to people like yourself who have a large impact in lives like myself's.
Well, Nolan, I have to then, turn the kudos straight back to you, because I do talk to a lot of people, but you are well informed. Your questions were, they were terrific, and I really enjoyed our conversation, pal.
Well, as I mentioned, that means a lot, and I appreciate certainly. As I just mentioned in the last question, I asked you about in terms of the strike. Of course, that is now away, and you're back. The guild has now had a strong deal that's in place now. In terms of any future projects that you're a part of or other things, social media, where can they find you in terms of news for that stuff?
Well, I don't really post a lot about stuff that I'm working on that I hope goes. I just tend to play my cards closer to the vest than some people do. Some people are
Yeah,
willing to talk about things. When they become real, that's when I, talk about them, because so much of what you develop and what you write and what you have these many balls you're juggling, which all
sure.
represent a project that you're hoping goes. And to talk about all of them, and I just, I'd rather talk about the one that goes. And
Yeah.
there's quite a few heading that direction, a couple poised, but so I tend to make, like on Facebook, on my personal page or my fan page, I'll talk about certain things sometimes.
Well,
But
when will they
right
come
now, I
out?
mean, the
When will they
last
come?
thing that I got made was something very different. I don't know if we talked about this, but was a documentary on kangaroos that's on Netflix
Okay.
called Kangaroo Valley. So we got nominated for an Emmy for that. We didn't win, but that was really cool. That was, something different for me.
Well, when something is made, it's completed. We'll find out about it some way, shape, or form.
Well, or something is in the process of being
Sure.
made, So that's when I'm certain, because it's just so difficult to get anything made, and oftentimes you think something's going to go and then it doesn't. I'd rather be the only one disappointed, not a bunch of fans who
Sure.
were hoping it would get made too. So that's why I kind of play things close to the vest. But yeah, there's ways to find out
Yeah.
what I'm up to for sure.
In today's day and age, there's always a way to find out something. Well, if you enjoyed the show, because who the heck wouldn't? And down the line, when this becomes a huge success, you're gonna want to subscribe, comment, share, all that fun jazz is to say with the algorithm. Of course, if you want more news and updates regarding the show, follow on Twitter, Nolan Carnite, Instagram, the Nolan Carnite Show. In the words of Johnny Carson, the dean of talk shows, just like this one, I bid you all a heartfelt good night. Till next time.